And so our next bunch of slides are actually going to be a little bit of an evaluation of how unreliable our memories are. So we're going to talk about misremembering, which is the idea that you think you're remembering something, but you're not remembering it correctly. And so this happens because memory is a constructive process. We might even call it reconstructive, because we're pulling things out of our long-term storage, and each time that we retrieve that information, we might start filling in some gaps. We start piecing together bits of information in ways that make sense. So, if I think about the last time I drove to campus a couple of weeks ago, I don't necessarily remember that exact drive to campus because I've done it hundreds of times over the years. But I could intuitively make an assumption of how that drive went based on the 100 drives before it. So I can kind of remember the route that I took and the fact that I was in my car and that nothing remarkable happened because nothing stands out in my brain. So I can piece it together, and I could, in my mind, play back a vision of me driving to campus. But I have no guarantees that that's exactly what happened the last time I drove to campus, because I was reconstructing that memory from some logical assumptions, some intuition, and things that make sense based on what was going on. And if we're doing this all the time with everything that we're kind of remembering, because our brains don't store every single detail, we end up with these highly inaccurate recollections. And schemas, those little shortcuts or tricks, things like, I know the route that I take to work every day, so I know how I got to school the last time I drove there, that would be a schema, and it can distort memories. So these little assumptions or mental shortcuts can actually cause some problems for us. And so in the textbook, they talk about an experiment where they show people a teddy bear sitting on a flight of stairs. And so they'll put this image up, and then they will take it away, and they will ask students, can you draw what you just saw? And so this memory construction, how we're remembering an event, is also going to apply to sort of the visualizing of that thing that we just saw. And we're not using our long-term memory yet. We're still in our short-term working memory. But when we're doing this, we're going to be reconstructing what we saw to draw on a piece of paper. And so university students that were shown that photograph will have that main object in the scene, and then they're going to draw everything around it. And we consistently see what's called a display, they will consistently display what's called a boundary extension. So they remember the scene being larger, or if they were standing further back than what it really was. And so this is what people tend to draw. So we still have a bear, not necessarily drawn by an artist, but there's a bear and they're sitting on some stairs. But if I flip back, wrong way, if I flip back to the original image, the bear was pretty much the entire image, and we can see sort of one full stair and two partial stairs, and that's it. But in this drawing here, we see lots and lots of stairs. So that person's memory of what they saw is completely different than what was actually seen. And this kind of subtle distortion is really important for things like eyewitness testimony. If, like me, you have been binge watching old crime shows with all of the time we have, maybe you're watching how much people care about what an eyewitness says about an event. And now we're starting to question how accurate is their recollection. And it's made even worse, where things like suggestive questioning can lead to inaccurate recall. So if a police officer starts asking a leading question, then we run into parts where maybe they're going to recall the thing wrong. So if they ask, what was he wearing? And the person wasn't really sure if they saw a man or a woman, Now in their mind, well, I was asked what he was wearing, so it must have been a man. So they'll adjust their memory to match that information. And it's not always an intentional process. Most witnesses aren't even aware of these slight distortions, but they do happen, and they can have some pretty severe consequences. And so one of these severe consequences was that there were 7 individual eyewitnesses that identified this priest here, Father Bernard Pagano, as a robber in a crime. And he went to jail and spent lots of time in prison until he was exonerated. But it's probably because information from the police, so the people who were questioning the witnesses, influenced the memory of those witnesses. How many more? I'm going to keep going. If you are looking for an interesting TED Talk about how misremembering and eyewitness accounts can affect people, this is a really fascinating, I think it's only like 10 minutes long, but just enough that I don't want to take our time up to watch it. It's a really interesting YouTube video, and it's a TED Talk about someone who has studied how people remember things incorrectly and how many people have ended up in jail because of inaccurate eyewitness testimony. It's a really fascinating video, and I usually love to show it in class, but we're going to keep going this time around. But if you want to spend a couple of minutes on your own watching that, it's a pretty interesting one. Okay, and that's our retrieval component. So we've done attention a while ago. We did encoding today. We've talked about rehearsal as part of storing and encoding information, and we just did retrieval. So what's left? And that's the part that isn't actually on here. It's storage, maintaining things in our long-term memory. And that's what we're going to end off with for today. So storage is talking about how information is retained over time. And if we think back to that computer analogy that we used at the very beginning, this is like our hard drive, storing information for the foreseeable future. But what do we know about how that information is stored? And if you've learned anything from this chapter, it's that the human brain is mysterious and we don't really know exactly how it's stored. But we do have a couple of theories. And the first of our theory is going to talk about associative networks. And so this theory says that memory can be represented as a network of associated concepts. So you have a mental concept map. So here we have a very small 2-dimensional representation of a bunch of concepts that we could think about. So we have a fire truck, and things that are kind of related to fire trucks but not fire trucks would be other vehicles, cars and vans. Fire trucks tend to be red, and then red makes us think of other colors. Fire trucks are also usually seen when there are fires, and fires associated with heat and maybe smoke and all sorts of things. So these concepts are all conceptually linked to each other within our brain. So each concept or idea is represented by a node, one of these circles with a word in it, and then the lines between the concepts, the black lines here, are going to represent associations, and shorter lines mean stronger relationships. So heat and fire are a lot easier to associate than fire and fire truck. And people who do research with these associative networks will actually run all sorts of types of tests and look at how people think about words. They'll show you a word and ask you to say the first thing that comes to mind when you think about whatever. So if I talk about fire, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And they'll study lots of people and see what words they think are related to it. And this associative network also helps explain how priming tends to work. So activating or thinking about one of our concepts can also activate other related concepts. So if we think about a fire truck, so if somebody says the word fire truck, then maybe it's going to be easier for us to remember the word fire truck in the future, but also it's easier to remember concepts that are closely related to fire trucks. So things nearby like fire or the color red or vehicles. So we can activate or prime these nodes that are nearby. And so again, priming is going to be activating another concept that's sort of related to the thing that we're currently thinking about. So exposure to one stimulus can influence a response to subsequent stimuli without conscious guidance or intention. So this isn't something that you're thinking about. Another example, so we start talking about fire engines, and then we take a break and somebody runs up to you and they say, hey, quick, what's your favorite color? Or give me a color. I guess favorite color is something you might already know. But name a color very quickly. You might think red because we had just finished talking about fire trucks. Unless, of course, you come from a country where your fire trucks are yellow, in which case you might say yellow because of the priming from talking about fire trucks. And again, it's not an exact science because everybody's brains are forming connections differently, and it's really hard to map these non-concrete concepts. Another way that we can think about organizing and storing information is in the idea of neural networks. And so just like our associative networks, we're still talking about linked nodes, but for our associative networks, those nodes were abstract concepts that were closely related. For a neural network, we're actually talking about physical objects. So a node would be one of our neurons. So our connection between neurons is how we are connecting our nodes. So a single node doesn't really contain a unit of information. This neuron is not the neuron for thinking about fire trucks, but it is a physical location that connects to other physical locations. So if a single neuron isn't a particular concept, then where are our single concepts stored? And they seem to be stored within a neural network, within sort of the distribution of the neural network. So a pattern or set of nodes that activate together. And so what we mean by this is if you look at somebody's brain in one of our imaging scans, and we can see the neurons or collections of neurons, we can't really get a really strong resolution like that. But if we ask somebody to think about the color red, a certain part of their brain will light up. A certain pattern of nodes or neurons in their brain lights up for that concept. It isn't any one neuron, but a certain part of their brain seems to react the same way when they think about a concept. You'll sometimes also see this called parallel distributed processing model instead of just neural networks. But it just means that you're having multiple neurons that are activated in processing information. They're distributed throughout your brain, and they're in parallel, they're all working together. So for our neural networks, we're looking on the idea of more the physical arrangement of our neurons and how they activate as a group when we think about a concept, whereas our associative networks are a conceptual representation, but it doesn't tell us anything about the physical neurons. So this is talking about that vague concepts, and this is talking about physical neurons. So that's our distinction between the two theories that people use to try and explain how we store memories. And again, neither is a complete picture, neither is more accurate than the other. These are just the models that are used by people doing research in this area. So both are still in use today. And so if there are researchers who are trying to figure out where the heck are we storing our memories, there's a couple of ways that they can study this. The And these are going to be very similar to what we talked about back in the earlier chapters when we talked about brain structures. So we can do lesion studies. In this case, a human lesion study wouldn't be that we are causing damage to the brain, but we could study how memory changes in people who have suffered brain damage from other sources. So you can study memory loss in people like HM who had a surgery that didn't necessarily do what they intended overall. You can also look at non-human animal studies. So you could actually cause deliberate damage to brain in brain regions in other organisms and see how their ability to learn and remember information changes. And we can also do brain imaging studies. So put people in an MRI and ask them to think about different concepts, see how their brains light up as they think about things. And all of these are some of the basic ways that we can try and figure out where our memories are. But overall, we're not quite sure where everything is. I'm going to give us, as a wrap-up, just some of the very basics of where things seem to be happening within the brain to the best of our knowledge. So our hippocampus, this seems to be involved in encoding, and we learned a lot of this from HM, who had his hippocampus removed. So the hippocampus seems to be involved in memory consolidation. So that's the idea of taking things from short-term memory and moving it into long-term memory. And it's going to give us meaning and the what, where, when, why, and how of things going on. It can be auditory or visual or olfactory. All sorts of senses can come together. But this is just taking the information that we have in our current short-term memory and storing it away to long-term memory that seems to be directed by our hippocampus. Our cerebral cortex seems to be involved in encoding information from our sensory registers. So as stuff is coming in from our senses, and it's going to also store some of our semantic information, general factual knowledge. And again, we don't have lots of specifics on this because we're not quite certain that this is how it works, but this seems to be mostly what's happening. And then finally, our prefrontal cortex. This seems to be involved in our working memory. And interestingly, our prefrontal cortex seems to be displaying some hemispheric lateralization. So the left prefrontal cortex shows increased activity when we're doing deep processing. So when we're thinking really hard with our working memory, so we see it light up on the left side, but not so much on the right. And again, we're not quite sure why that happens, but there does seem to be some kind of lateralization there where the left side of our prefrontal cortex is involved in our working memory, and the right side is not active to the same extent. But again, we're kind of ending on this is kind of maybe what we think might be happening based on what we've learned.